Second quick example was the Suez Crisis in 1956. In October 1956, the invasion of Egypt by Britain, France, and Israel in response to Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser's nationalization of the Suez Canal a few months earlier brought together four dangerous geopolitical dynamics. The Arab-Israeli conflict, this being the second regional war since the failed 1948 UN Palestine partition plan. A third world nationalism, Nasser's Suez Canal nationalization being hailed in the colonial and ex-colonial world as a blow against European imperialism. The Cold War, Nasser having tilted to the Soviet bloc, and the UN's own credibility, two permanent Security Council members as part of the attack on another member state. Pretty explosive situation. And we have a tendency to think things get resolved. Oh, it couldn't have been so bad. But if you go back to the newspapers of the day, you see it was pretty tense. So Hammarskjöld worked the statecraft. Within days, he had engineered the very first emergency special session of the General Assembly under a precedent called Uniting for Peace, which empowered the General Assembly to act when the Security Council is paralyzed, and to do so without being subject to Security Council permanent members' veto. By 64-5, a resolution was passed calling for an immediate ceasefire, the withdrawal of all foreign troops, and empowering the Secretary-General to take further action. Eisenhower, unlike his Secretary of State, was shrewd enough to see how the British-French-Israeli invasion was playing into Soviet opportunism. The last thing we must do, Ike stated at a news conference, is to disturb any of the delicate negotiations now going on under the leadership of Secretary-General Hammarskjöld. We must do nothing that could possibly delay his operations, impede them, or hurt them anyway. You can see where this is going for 21st century applications. U.S. imposed sanctions, pretty tough sanctions on Britain. And the two together, within 10 days of the initial invasion, this UN-U.S. combination got the British and French to agree to a ceasefire. Given the already checkered history of Middle East ceasefires, there needed to be some mechanism for enforcement and stability. Working closely with the Canadian Foreign Minister and UN Ambassador Lester Pearson, Hammarskjöld and Pearson developed a plan for a United Nations emergency force to fill this role. They did this pretty much from whole cloth. This was the very first UN peacekeeping operation. Pearson will win the Nobel Prize for this. Hammarskjöld will get a Nobel Prize later in 1961. But you know, there are practical questions. What about uniforms? You know, having a distinctive insignia would both help with the safety and be good for esprit de corps. This is where the blue helmets, blue berets came from. There wasn't time to place a large manufacturing order, so they got U.S. Army surplus helmets and painted them blue. How to put together a force quickly with an acceptable composition? Answer, draw troops from countries that were not permanent members of the Security Council. And since only the United States had the logistical capabilities to get them to Egypt expeditiously, set up an arm's length arrangement whereby U.S. airlifts would move the UN troops to a staging area outside Egypt. How to overcome Egyptian concerns about sovereignty? Hammarskjöld devised a formula that basically was acceptable to Nasser. You know, it's a great story. The crisis was diffused. Let me just pick something out of my hat and let me call it Syria, where the United States and Russia continue to be unable and unwilling to manage this conflict, let alone play roles in resolving it. And a little aside, in 2015-16, I was involved with 3 other colleagues in doing some back-channel work for the Obama administration on trying to meet with the Russians on some possible ways of working together. We actually thought we were making progress, but we never fully tested because our last meeting was in August 2016. We actually met in a hotel in Prague, and we were emailing the other day saying, was that guy wearing the Groucho Marx outfit in the lobby? Was that Michael Cohen? You know, just things you think of in retrospect, right? In any event, the piece I'm writing now for Foreign Affairs really makes an argument about, you know, why not empower Secretary-General Guterres to play a Hammarskjöldian role instead of being consigned to the sidelines and just with statements like reiterating concern. There's been a U.S. Special Envoy, but has not had the backing and authority to genuinely negotiate, to bring pressures on the parties. It would never mean imposing fundamentally unacceptable terms on Washington or Moscow. Hammarskjöld didn't do that at the same time as Suez. The Soviet invasion of Hungary happened. Hammarskjöld deferred largely to the Soviets there with an understandable acknowledgement of great power politics. But it actually could mean better options than either is capable of getting into its own. And I have some reasons for thinking that this might be in the Russians' interest as well as the Americans' interest that, again, we can talk about as an offshoot of the book. And there's a larger argument, you know, about the ways in which if the UN is ever going to be effective, it needs to have a stronger Secretary General. And I know the politics of this. I know what they are in China. I know what they are in Russia. I know what they are in the United States. But if you really think about it, it's actually the major powers that would benefit most from having the UN more capable to do what they don't want to do, and only the UN can conceivably do it. It would by no means solve all the UN's problems, but I think there's something to be learned here that could be very beneficial, and I go into that in a bit of detail at the end.